I sculpted my first original character and I am excited to show her to you. To start out, I grabbed my large armature wire that I got from Michael's and I cut a large piece and I shape it into the shape that I want my figure to be in. Getting her pose right was a little bit of a challenge. I am new to figure sculpting and I had to use a lot of references in order to get a pose that I was happy with that I also thought I could pull off. Once I had a basic pose I was happy with, I wrapped it in some extra thin wire just to give my clay something to adhere to. Then I took some bacon bond and some ultralight clay and shaped out her torso and then baked her, covered her in some super sculpty clay on top of that. Next I move on to her legs. This back leg was a little bit more difficult than the front leg because it was closer to the ground and I had less space to work with. I had to adjust her body slightly so I can make room for her back foot and also make sure that that foot is big enough to kind of feel Hobbit-like, but also not too big that it looks too big. I think I did a decent job though. Once I was mostly happy with the back leg, I move on to her front leg. In terms of proportions of her front and back foot, I feel like I failed in getting them to match. After baking her, I realized that I think I made her front foot a little too closer to a human-sized foot as opposed to a hobbit-sized foot. But when you try something new and you don't do it quite right, you just make sure you do it better on the next one. To create her tunic, I take a long strip of clay and I wrap it around the bottom portion of where that tunic would go, and then I blend it into her torso to give it that illusion that there is a tunic there. Then I take some little tiny clay noodles and I place them strategically where I think that wrinkles in the tunic would go. Next, I add like this waist sash thing that goes around her waist. I'm not really sure what it's called, but I take some little clay noodles and I blend it in to make it look like it's bunched up in places around her waist. Next, I take my needlepoint tool and I create a line down the center of her chest to create where the tunic meets in the middle, and then I take some triangle shaped pieces to make the colors. I really like the look of those crossbody shoulder belt straps, so I'm adding one across her shoulders and then also one around her waist. Next, I take a little squarish lump of clay and add some lines to make a little flap, or illusion of a flap, to create a pouch for the side of her belt. I use some bacon bond and blend it into her belt to help it really stick to her side. Next, to make sure that this pouch can actually stay closed, I add a little strap to the front of the pouch. Next, I add some little tiny clay noodles to create a belt buckle. I use my spoon tool to help shape and blend all those little noodles together. Next, I take a little tiny ball of clay and I put it right in the center of that buckle to make it look like it's looped through the buckle. Then I create another one for her shoulder strap. This cowl thing that goes around her neck was going to be the base of her hood, and I've given these nice wrinkles, but later you'll find you can't even see it. Moving on to her pants, I take some clay noodles and wrap them around the upper portion of her bottom leg and blend it in to give it that look of the bottom part of her pants. I also take some little tiny clay noodles where I think that there would be some folds and wrinkles. Once I was finished with the front leg, I did the exact same thing on the back leg. I know that hobbits are typically stereotyped to being very tough-footed and don't really need shoes, but I wanted to cover her feet up somehow, so I took these little leather straps that she would wrap around her legs. Maybe she did it to hide her skin color so she wouldn't be so bright in the dark. Not entirely sure why she wears them, but she wears them maybe for protection against gunk and dirt on the ground. Thought it was a cool look though. Moving on to her arms, I add some clay and wrap it around the armature wire and blend it in, and I do the exact same thing I did with her pants. Take a little clay noodle and wrap it right around her elbow joint area, blend it in to give it the look of the base of her sleeve, and then add some little noodles for the wrinkles and folds. Moving on to her hands. I am not very good at hands at all, but this hobbit is holding daggers, so it's really just a fist. So I take a little ball of clay, add some lines and shape it to look like fingers. Then I take a little bit of an armature wire that will be the structure for her daggers, and then shape her thumb around that. Once I was happy with it, I stick it onto the end of her arm and then blend it in. Now for her arms, she also wears leather straps around her fingers and her forearms, so I do the same thing I did with her legs and wrap some leather straps around and then blend it in nicely. Once I finish with this arm, I repeat the same process on the other arm. Once I was completely happy with how she was looking, I put her entire body in the oven to bake so I didn't mess anything up once I added her head. Once her body is finished baking, I take some armature wire, some foil, and some super sculpty clay, and I begin to shape her head. I add a little lump of clay around the base of her skull to start to create her jawline. Next, I take a triangle-shaped piece of clay and I place it where her nose would go, and then I blend it in. I take a ball tool to create her eye socket area. Then I take some balls of clay to build up her cheek area right around her eyes. I felt like her forehead area wasn't deep enough, so I added a strip of clay around her brow line and then blended it in to really make those eye socket areas more pronounced. Next, I take some little, thick hot dog shaped pieces of clay to start to build out her lips. This process was a long process. I've never made a mouth before, and she has a duck face for a really long time before I was really happy with the smirk that she has at the end. To add a little bit more character, I bend one of her eyebrow lines down a little bit just to give it more of a facial expression. Then I add little balls of clay where her eyes will go, then some little clay noodles on top to create the eyelids. Getting the eyelids to look just right was actually a lot harder than I thought it would be. Blending it in to make sure that they don't look too thin or too thick and getting that right was a challenge. But I think I did an okay job. It just took me a long time. Once I finally settled, I was happy with her face. I added some eyebrows right where her eyebrows would go. Moving on to her ears, I had to study a lot of reference photos for Elvish and Hobbit ears to get the right shape of what these ears would look like. I also watched Ace of Clay's ear tutorial, which helped a lot in getting the right shape. But I will say that the ears and hair that I do all feels pointless because I cover it up in a hood later anyway. So I'm adding it to the video to make sure you see that I did it and I'm proud of it. And at the very least, I got practice in ear and hair that nobody will ever see. Anyways, moving on, I take some little clay noodles to create some hair on the front of her head, and then I take a needlepoint tool to add some hair texture. Next, I take some little hot dog shaped pieces of clay and I start forming a braid that she wears on the back of her head. I did this really nice, elaborate braided hair on the back of her head and no one will ever see it. But I will say I enjoyed learning how to make a braid on someone's head. I add some more hair texture with my needlepoint tool to her braid and all the hair around her braid. I add a few more strands of hair around her face on the other side just to kind of really frame her hair nicely, and then I finish off the hair texture. And her head is done. Once I attach her head to her body, I added a little bit more clay around that cowl that you won't even see later. Then I add some clay to her daggers and the little strip of clay around where her handles would be. Once I was happy with the shape of her daggers, I put her in for another bake. Next, after she's finished baking, I get to move on to my favorite part, which is the painting part, because that just brings her completely to life. Now, her skin tone looks a little yellow because I had to mix my color and I did not mix it properly. I did end up painting it a more, less jaundice colored skin tone, but you won't see it until the end. I painted her tunic this nice forest green to really accentuate her attunement to nature. She wears these really dark brown pants and then the leather brown straps on her legs and arms. I painted her shoulder straps and belt strap this lighter, almost tan leather color, and then the strap around her waist is a slightly darker brown, kind of matching her pants. Her pouch is the same color as the straps on her shoulder and belt. Next, I paint the buckles on her pouch and her belt strap a nice silver paint. I paint the hilt guard of the daggers a dark grayish color, and then the same silver color that I used for the buckles, I paint her daggers. To add a little bit more life to her face, I paint her eyeballs white. And while I wait for the white on her eyes to dry, I paint her hair this burgundy reddish color just because I thought it was a cool color. I take a slightly pinker version of her skin tone and I paint her lips just to make it look like a natural lip color, and then I paint the pupils of her eyes. Next, I paint a grayish green color to the cowl around her neck. At the beginning of this sculpt, I wasn't entirely sure I was going to do a hood. I knew for a fact I was going to do a cloak, but I decided I was going to add a hood, which covers all of those nice details. And because I do sew a little bit and I don't know how to make a hood otherwise, I put together this hood like I would if I were sewing. Then I took a long strip of clay with a circle cut out and blended it around the base of the hood to make that cloak. Next, I take some larger clay noodles and I wrap them around the base of her hood to create the folds around the hood and cloak. For this hobbit, I used Super Sculpey Original mixed with some gray Primo Sculpey to create my cloak. I didn't like it because it was very hard to get the shape that I wanted. I would recommend using Cause Clay. It holds the shape so much better and it just feels like it's less likely to break once you've baked it. Anyways, back to what I'm doing here. I added some clay to my base and I'm just using my spoon tool to create some grass texture because she's a hobbit and she's outside all the time. Lastly, I add a little circle brooch clasp to the front of her cloak, and then I put her in for her final bake. I painted her cloak the same greenish gray color that I painted the little cowl around her neck that you can no longer see. I will say it would be better to use colored clay for this. I always tell myself it'll be fine. I don't need to worry about it. I can just paint it. And then I end up having to get into these weird nooks and crannies and regret it. Learn from me. Use colored clay for things that are hard to reach when painting. Also, pro tip, plan your sculpts out better. Make sure that your grass is painted and sculpted before you add your cloak so that it's easier to paint. Lastly, I finish her off by painting the wood base a nice black color to make the rest of the sculpt really pop. And now that she's finished, she's ready for the glamour shots. And there she is, Elowyn, the assassin hobbit that's really good with daggers. Let me know in the comments what you think of her. I'm very proud of her, and I love that she is my first original character.